In the heart of Europe, during the late Middle Ages and into the early modern era, fear took on a new form. It was not fear of foreign armies, nor of kings or bandits, but of neighbors, midwives, and widows. This was the era of the great witch hunts, a dark chapter of history when superstition, religion, and politics combined into a storm of fire and shadows. The roots of the witch craze lay in an age of uncertainty. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, Europe was plagued by disasters. The Black Death had wiped out millions, famine struck regularly, and wars seemed endless. To explain such suffering, many turned to the supernatural. Who was causing crops to fail? Who was spreading disease? Who was whispering to the devil in the dead of night? The answer, in the minds of many, was witches. At first, medieval Europe had a more complex view of magic. In some regions, people spoke of cunning folk, healers, herbalists, and wise women who provided remedies and charms. They were not always condemned. But as the influence of the church grew, distinctions between white magic and dark magic began to fade. To the zealous eye, all dealings with supernatural forces became suspect, and a healer could easily be recast as a servant of the devil. The real spark, however, came in the 15th century with the publication of one of the most notorious books ever written, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Written by two German inquisitors in 1487, this grim manual declared that witches were not only real but were servants of Satan, guilty of heresy, and deserving of death. It described in gruesome detail how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, and how to destroy them. The book spread like wildfire across Europe. Soon, accusations of witchcraft became more than local gossip. They became official trials sanctioned by church and state. Anyone could be accused. A poor beggar woman who asked for bread and was refused, only for a cow to fall sick the next day, a midwife who delivered a stillborn child, or an old man whose strange mutterings unsettled his neighbors. Suspicion required little proof, and once the finger was pointed, the machinery of persecution turned mercilessly. By the 16th century, mass witch trials erupted across Germany, Switzerland, and France. In towns like Würzburg and Bamberg, entire communities were consumed by hysteria. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, were accused, tortured, and burned in a single wave. Torture chambers became factories of confessions, producing wild stories of Sabbaths, flying through the night, and feasting with demons. Under the agony of the rack or the crushing boots, victims confessed to impossible crimes, implicating friends, neighbors, even family, just to end the suffering. The hunts were not just about religion or fear of the devil. They were also about control. Political leaders found witch trials a convenient way to display their piety and authority. Villagers used accusations to settle grudges, seize property, or eliminate rivals. A widow's field, once she was executed, could be claimed by her accuser. Behind the smoke of burning pyres lay greed, envy, and human cruelty dressed in the robes of righteousness. And so, the fire spread. The flames of suspicion did not stay confined to one land. From the German states to the far reaches of Scandinavia, from the hills of Scotland to the forests of Poland, the witch hunts spread like a disease of the mind. Each region, each village, had its own stories and its own tragedies. In Scotland, the hunts took on a particularly ferocious character. King James VI, later James I of England, was obsessed with witches. Convinced that dark magic had conspired against him personally, he became one of Europe's most zealous witch hunters. His book Demonology, published in 1597, argued that witches were real, dangerous, and must be destroyed. Under his reign, thousands were accused, many of them poor women, dragged from their homes and subjected to brutal ordeals. One infamous method was swimming the witch. The accused was bound and thrown into a river or lake. If she floated, it was proof she had rejected holy water and was therefore guilty. If she sank and drowned, she was considered innocent, but of course, she was dead. In such trials, there was no escape, only cruelty disguised as justice. Meanwhile, in the German city of Würzburg during the 1620s, one of the most catastrophic witch trials in history unfolded. The city's prince-bishop launched a campaign of terror, resulting in the execution of over 900 people in just a few years. The victims were not only poor peasants but also nobles, students, and even children as young as 9 years old. Entire families were wiped out, their confessions squeezed out through torture until the flames consumed them. In neighboring Bamberg, the madness was just as intense. There, a man named Johannes Junius, the city's mayor, was accused of witchcraft. His letters from prison survive to this day, describing in heartbreaking detail the torture he endured and the lies he was forced to confess. He wrote to his daughter, telling her he was innocent, but that he had named names only because the torment was unbearable. Days later, he too was burned. His story stands as one of the most haunting testimonies of the witch craze. But the hysteria was not limited to continental Europe. Across the sea in England, the notorious witch-finder Matthew Hopkins prowled the countryside during the English Civil War. Calling himself the Witch-Finder General, he claimed divine authority to root out witches, often for a fee. In just a few short years, Hopkins and his men were responsible for the deaths of more than 300 women, far more than had ever been executed in England before. Armed with cruel tests and relentless accusations, he became the embodiment of greed cloaked in zealotry. The tide of fear eventually crossed the Atlantic. In 1692, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was shaken by the Salem witch trials, perhaps the most infamous witch hunt in the New World. What began with the strange fits of young girls soon spiraled into mass panic. Ministers declared that Satan had infiltrated the colony. Neighbors turned against neighbors, and in a matter of months, dozens were imprisoned and 20 people executed, most by hanging. The Salem trials exposed the destructive power of fear in a small, isolated community, and remain a lasting symbol of hysteria gone unchecked. By the time the witch craze finally began to fade in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, tens of thousands had been executed across Europe. The fires dimmed not because of mercy, but because doubt began to creep into the minds of judges and rulers. Enlightenment thinkers challenged the very idea of witchcraft. Scholars questioned the legality of torture and the reliability of confessions extracted under agony. Slowly, the old fears gave way to skepticism. Yet, for the countless who had already perished in fire and shadow, the change came far too late. Why did the witch hunts take hold with such ferocity? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in the tangled web of fear, belief, and power. At the heart of it was fear, fear of the unknown, fear of disease, famine, and war. In times of chaos, people crave explanations. When harvests failed or storms destroyed ships, when plagues swept through towns or children died without warning, the human mind searched for meaning. Instead of chance or nature, the blame fell upon neighbors who were different, vulnerable, or disliked. Accusations became a way to make sense of suffering, and a tool to cast out those who did not belong. Religion gave these fears a voice of authority. The Christian Church taught that the devil was real and active in the world, seeking souls to corrupt. Preachers warned that witches were his servants, conspiring against Christendom. To believe otherwise was to doubt the faith itself. This spiritual framework turned suspicion into heresy, and heresy into death. But there was also power at work. Rulers and judges saw in the witch hunts an opportunity to display strength. Trials reinforced their control, sending a message: obey the law, obey the church, or suffer the same fate as the condemned. Greed played its role too. Property seized from the executed enriched accusers, officials, and courts. The machinery of persecution fed upon itself, rewarding those who fueled the fire. The psychology of the hunts was equally cruel. Once fear gripped a community, it spread like wildfire. To question the trials was to risk suspicion yourself. To defend an accused which was to invite accusations. Under torture, people confessed to impossible crimes, implicating others simply to end their pain. Lies multiplied, and every new confession dragged more names into the abyss. It was a spiral of terror with no escape. And yet, out of this darkness, lessons emerged. The end of the witch hunts marked the slow birth of a new way of thinking, the beginning of the Enlightenment. Reason, science, and skepticism began to challenge superstition. Philosophers argued for evidence, fairness, and human rights. Though progress was uneven, the idea that justice must rest upon proof, not fear, grew stronger. The legacy of the witch hunts remains with us today. The very word, witch hunt, has become a metaphor for mass hysteria, false accusations, and blind persecution. From political purges to social media storms, echoes of the past remind us how easily fear can turn into fury and suspicion into injustice. But the human stories remain the most haunting of all. Behind every execution was a life, a woman who healed with herbs, a man whose words were misunderstood, a child who cried out in fear. They were caught in a storm of belief and power far greater than themselves. They died not because they were witches, but because others believed they were. This is the true tragedy of the European witch hunts, a time when shadows ruled and the fire of superstition consumed the innocent.